Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to our Nancy Drew review series, where we are ranking every single Nancy Drew game on 6 key aspects. First being the story and premise, second being the suspects, third being the puzzles, fourth being the music, 5 being the atmosphere, and 6 being the ending of each game. I'm your host, Jameson.
And I'm Julian. What's going on, everyone?
And today we are reviewing Nancy Drew, The Curse of Blackmoor Manor.
Curse of Blackmoor Manor is the 11th installment in the Nancy Drew Her interactive video game series. And if I'm not mistaken, the first game in which Nancy starts to travel internationally.
That's right, this game is in London, England, not the most exotic place for her to go to, but they make do with the setting pretty well.
The opening letter for this game is honestly one of my favorites. It starts off with a naturally sarcastic line from Nancy where she claims to Ned she's going to jolly old England, where she's going to be visiting her neighbor's daughter, Linda Petrov.
Because ever since Linda's moved into the Blackmoor Manor Penvillin estate, she's been having a lot of troubles that she's been very mysterious about. She's been very pale, her skin's been dry, her mouth's been dry, she stays in her bedroom all day and has recently put up a curtain allowing nobody to see her at any time.
Now, while at first you may be thinking that Linda is infected with COVID-19, now while at face value these symptoms kind of seem all ordinary of normal flu, and Linda's mom, Mrs. Petrov, is convinced that there is something much more that meets the eye, and as we'll go to find out as we play through the game, she is perhaps going under a werewolf transformation.
Lycanthropic metamorphosis? When Nancy first pulls up to the manor, she's dropped off by a British taxi driver who greets her with says goodbye with "night, miss," and "good luck," which is a bit sinister. And Nancy walks up the dark moor, all the steps to the way to the manor, and it's such a creepy cinematic because it really makes you wait while the crickets and frogs are chirping and croaking, and you just hear every single one of her footfalls with the heels on the stone. And then just as she gets to the door, she hears somebody call her name, and it's just this creepy voice, "Nancy."
Nancy's scared and turns around in fright to find 2 red eyes, huge eyes at that, just staring at you. And that's when Mrs. Drake opens the door, Nancy turns around, and here we meet our first suspect of the game.
So I guess that's a good way to segue into suspects then. So first, for suspects, we ought to go ahead and lay down the relevant Penvillin family tree. So Alan Penvillin is the grandfather of the youngest generation, which is Jane. Jane is maybe an 11-year-old girl, and she is the first child suspect in the Nancy Drew series. Spoiler alert, she's also the first child culprit, and the only child culprit. Jane's true father is Hugh Penvillin, who is a British diplomat who has recently married Linda Petrov after a divorce with his original wife, who was an opera singer, and that is Jane's biological mother. And so Linda is the new wife of Hugh, and she's trying to get to know her stepdaughter Jane, and due to the 6-month habitation clause, which is a very interesting piece of motive for some characters that we'll get into in a bit, she is having to spend 6 months living in the Penvillin estate, and she's only a couple weeks into it, and she's already experiencing some really big difficulties. But anyhow, Mrs. Drake is the aunt of Hugh and the great-aunt of Jane. She's an older woman, she speaks in Cockney rhymes, and she's a bit batty.
After the encounter with the red eyes outside, Nancy gets greeted into the main hall of Blackmoor Manor by Mrs. Drake. Mrs. Drake goes on to spout about how all those Americans over there with their loud radios and such are always distracted, and Nancy was simply distracted, and that there was some logical explanation for the red eyes that she saw outside. And I gotta say, she's not one of my favorite characters in this game.
She's annoying. She speaks Cockney, which is like British slang, except you make everything rhyme, and I hate Cockney. But it's just an annoying bit of the game where she's always going on about stuff like that. The only other person who speaks Cockney is the Boar's Head pub chef. I think his name's Johnny. And he's a lot more fun to talk to because you don't actually have to endure him throughout the entirety of the game.
After the conversation in the Great Hall with Mrs. Drake, she'll invite you to become situated in your room. And I love the room. I don't want to get too much into atmosphere right now, but since it's right at the very beginning of the game, here with the premise, Nancy's room is great. And it's overall, I think, my favorite place Nancy sleeps at in any Nancy Drew game.
She's got purple walls, she's got a velvet comforter. On one of the walls is this giant mural of Poseidon being pulled in a chariot, which is pulled by dolphins or something.
It's just wild.
It's a radical room. You don't think of like an old stereotypical mansion when you think of this game. This is probably one of the most colorful Nancy Drew games.
It is. The mansion's beautiful, and I don't want to touch much on atmosphere, but it's It's honestly the game's strongest point in my opinion. That and music, but
You know, I'd go as far as to call the atmosphere better than the music in this game.
interesting take. Yeah, I can see that.
So Mrs. Drake is down in the observatory, and then across the hall from her in the Great Hall is the library where you find Nigel Mukherjee, who I think is my favorite suspect of the game. Nigel, I think he's British Indian or something like that, and he just has this stodgy British scholarly accent. And on any other character, I feel like that would have made them really annoying. But Nigel's friendly. He's not like some stuck-up jerk or anything. First line he gets to you is just like, "Ah, yes, are you here from the agency?"
Nigel's character resides in the library the entirety of the game, and once you get to the about 2/3 point of the game, he actually never returns, which is sad because
Nancy scares him into believing that the castle's haunted, and she never tells him why. But basically, the reason that Nigel is here is because he is a scholar who's actually trying to do research and write a book about the Penvillin family history. Because as a family, the Penvillins have always been very private about their affairs, and very little has been documented about them besides them being a prominent family in some parts of English history. And so Nigel is doing research in the Penvillin Library, and the Penvillin Library doesn't have much going on in it. There aren't any puzzles or anything, or hardly any. But he has such a fun mojo with Nancy. Whenever Nancy sneezes, or whenever he sneezes, Nancy will, like, say a bless you in a foreign language, and then he will, like, say thank you in the same language. It just goes off over and over. Like, she goes, Butadorov, and he goes, Spatsy.
he's very smart. He strikes me as the type of guy that doesn't get out much, but he's funny.
Dead languages aren't really his bag, though.
That's true. Not a big Latin scholar, I suppose, but
Yeah.
one word to describe Nigel, I'm not even sure this was intentional, but I would just say funny. He comes off as that way. I think it's
dry
just
humor. He never laughs at himself.
right. Now, I want to move on to the child suspect of the game, Jane Penvillin. Now, it's important to note that this was the very first child suspect that Her Interactive made, and I don't think her design is... It's pretty weak, honestly.
I want to applaud the ambition. That was cool that they thought they'd change it up and make a suspect a child. But they messed up her design. She looks malnourished.
Yeah, she kind of looks starved, especially her arms. They kind of look like twigs. If you take a good look at her, at least.
Yeah, she's so skinny, and she feels unnaturally skinny. I don't know what they were going for. It's like she's wearing a corset in every scene, almost.
Now, Jane spends all of her time in her room. Her room is another great place. I don't want to touch on atmosphere too much, but Jane decorated it really well. And there's a lot of stuff in the room that goes along with Jane's character. For instance, all of the monster books and all of her study material, like her family tree. There's a lot of cool interactive things in Jane's room that she can chime in on.
I really like how you can interact with the family tree, as Julian said, and you can just click on each name and ask Jane, hey, who was Odo Penvillin? And then she goes on this history spiel that she's been taught. One of the things about the game that I think is creepiest, and it should be noted that this is one of the creepier Nancy Drew games. I wouldn't call it the scariest, but it does have a good bit of creeps and spooks here and there. One of the cool things about Jane's character, which I think is really creepy, she's constantly being tutored by a woman named Ethel Bosany, who comes from a long lineage of Penvillin tutors. And it's very, very strange because every now and again you see snippets of her syllabus, and she's got some stuff in there that makes sense, like, you know, just algebra and basic physics and stuff like that. And then she starts to have more unorthodox classes like Latin and Penvillin family study and history, to the point where she's like being taught old Penvillin's folk songs like the Ballad of Bridget, which is really cool, and I like that. We'll get into that probably in Atmosphere. But it almost starts to feel like Jane's being radicalized in some sort of thing, and there's like a lot of dark Penvillin secrets going on.
Now, with Jane's character, it's important to get into the dichotomy she shares with her mother-in-law, Linda.
Oh, yeah.
The two of them do not like each other, and they're both pretty outspoken about that. Jane claims that she misses her real mom, a completely reasonable take, and that she doesn't like Linda that much for obvious reasons, her just being thrown into the family all willy-nilly. Linda, on the other hand, thinks Jane is a completely weird child and doesn't really want to spend any time with her. She says she's too obsessed with monsters, she's creepy, she's annoying, there's a bunch of things. But the two characters never actually interact with each other. All the gossiping is done with Nancy being in the middle of it.
Yeah, it's a pretty weird dynamic. By the way, it should be noted that Linda is constantly behind a curtain for the entire game. There's one sequence where you can see through a peephole that she's got hair growing all over her arms, which is even more
concerning.
Yeah, especially towards the lycanthropic metamorphosis theory. But on that regard, I think that Linda was a really good character solely because they voice acted her really, really well. I'm not sure many people suspected her of being the culprit, of like trying to poison herself for some reason, but I feel like that she did a really good job with her lines. Sometimes in the late game, it gets a little corny. We're just like, oh, I feel so hungry. Get out right now.
Yeah, Linda has some really crazy lines like that. And then also with the "get out, I'm hungry" line, she orders a completely raw steak that just sits next to her bedside. I mean,
Medium raw.
They're just throwing these examples of, look, Linda is turning into a werewolf right in front of our eyes.
Yeah.
A couple of them are a little corny like that, but yeah. I would have liked to have seen her. I think it was just an attempt to save on animation. You can see her shadow moving behind the curtains of her bed, but it would have been nice to see her. Can you imagine if we saw her character undergo a transformation throughout the game or something?
In the opening letter, you can see her in the background of a shot.
Yeah, I don't know. I agree with Jameson that I like her character a lot. She's very well voice acted. You can hear the emotion of a very scared person who doesn't know what the heck is going on with their body, but I would have appreciated to see their body.
Yeah, I guess I can second that. And then,
lastly, Ethel Bosley.
We got two little characters to cover up. So Ethel Bosley is, as we mentioned before, Jane's tutor, and she's a very, very interesting character because technically this is the first game with more than 4 characters, even though you can't see Linda and you can't regularly talk to Ethel. Counts to 6 if you count the parrot, but we'll get to Lulu in a minute. But Ethel Bosley is an interesting character because you only run into her 3 times in the game in scripted events. The first time is when you leave Jane's room after you first meet her, and she just runs into you in the hallway. And you get to introduce yourself, you don't really get to pick any dialogue options, and she just seems like a nice lady. Just, you know that she's Jane's tutor, and that Jane probably just sees her as a teacher, and teachers are usually boring, but you don't think much of her. The second time is after the first time you come out of the East Hall after finding the secret passageway, and she asks what you were doing in there. And you have the option to tell her that you found a secret passageway, or you can just tell her that you were looking at the artwork and the paintings and stuff. And that's interesting because she would be really inclined to know that you found a secret passageway. Because as you discover throughout the game, she is wrapped up in some more and more sinister stuff with Jane. We'll get towards that in the atmosphere and ending. And finally, after you go down a slide puzzle at one part of the game, where you can just actually slide down a slide in the walls of the manor, I'm not making this up, she can run into you when you exit it, and she kind of just catches you red-handed, knowing that you lied to her about secret passageways. And so that's a pretty intense meeting.
Important to note that almost every time It's important to note that almost every encounter you have with Ethel, it's almost like a jump scare.
Yeah.
Honestly. Because you just walk forward, and then it's not loading her in front of you until she's immediately in front of you and the conversation started, so it kind of is like a jump scare.
It's like walking out of your room in Warnings at Waverly to just have Izzy Romero in your face at the beginning.
Yeah, and as Jamie mentioned, there's only 3 instances in the entire game where you can actually talk with her. And
you never know they're coming.
Yeah, you never know they're coming. I would have appreciated it a lot more if Ethel. Obviously, she's very well regarded.
If they were to remaster, I'm sorry, I keep interrupting you. If they were to remaster this game, it would be cool if you could like find her in her off hours grading Jane's homework in the library in a different cubicle or something.
I was saying.
You were?
Yes.
Oh wow.
Yeah, I would have greatly appreciated a designated place for Ethel to go to talk to whenever, because her just spawning right in front of you to talk to you in 3 instances in the game and then kind of dip after that, it felt like a very underused character, and she had a lot of potential to be a cool culprit. She had the motive, she had everything there, but her character wasn't utilized, and that was, in my opinion, a notable flaw with this game.
Now, the last thing that I think we gotta cover as far as suspects go has got to be Lulu the parrot. Lulu is
annoying.
Yeah. Lulu's an annoying parrot. She's always like shouting movie quotes like, "You're gonna need a bigger boat," whenever you walk by her. Sometimes she says it 3 times in a row, and it's just annoying.
Now, Lulu's backstory, she's almost 100 years old. She's in
her 80s.
Yeah, she's been in the Penvlin family for years on years, which also adds to her knowledge of the history of the family, which is of course relevant to the plot later on. Lulu helps you with multiple puzzles, it's worth noting, but
she was apparently brought back from the Amazon by I think John Penvlin, and eventually she learned to talk from sailors on the ship, and so she was just cussing like a pirate for years. And then they taught her proper English and manners, and she grew up playing with Alan Penvlin and his sister, Mrs. Drake. Letitia Drake, that's her name. Her first name is Letisa. Mm-hmm. Man, I could never remember that. So that just about wraps up Suspects, and then brings us into puzzles, which I think debatably could be the best part of the game. What do you say about puzzles?
The puzzles in this game are definitely on the higher scale of difficulty when compared to other Nancy Drew games. If I had to put it on a 1 to 10 scale, I'd honestly go with around an 8 or 9.
Now here's the thing, I'd agree that they are difficult, but at the same time, if you are observant and you like pay attention to stuff and you check Nancy's observations and you read every book you find or can at least skim it to get a grasp of what's being said in the writing, then you will have a really good time in this game.
The puzzles are all really cool, and it's important to note that there's like 3 secret passageways in this game. There's a ton of secret passageways, and those are kind of puzzles in and of themselves, but puzzles are a lot of fun. They're all logical, but yeah, you will get stumped on a first playthrough of this game. That's almost guaranteed.
Yeah, it's important to remember that Nancy has a cell phone in this game with a web browser, because as the game progresses, you can go on your phone to check out some different websites that contain mandatory and crucial information in order to solve some puzzles.
My favorite puzzle of this game, I'm either going to have to go with the Ghost Scavenger Hunt by Alan Penvillin.
Oh, that was a classic. Take some time to talk about that.
So the Ghost Hunt was devised by Alan Penvillin. Alan, we never get to meet the guy, sadly, but you get the impression he's just a fun, happy-go-lucky guy. He's a very modern heir of the Penvillin estate. Did he pass away?
Yeah, he was Jane's grandfather.
Yeah. He was also Jane's grandfather, sadly passed away, though, so would have been a cool character, but at least we get his mention, and he actually is the contributor to a couple puzzles for us, all of which are fun ones, but the Ghost Hunt, it starts with going to the computer that's in the library and having to type in his password. All you have to do is go to Alan's coat of arms in the main hall. Notice that the password is Pergamentum Exit. Nancy actually won't remark about this or anything. You just have to kind of infer that Pergamentum Exit, the 2 words on his coat of arms, are his password.
And if you win a game of Skull and Bones with Jane, she tells you that it's his password.
That too.
But you never forget Pergamentum Exit once you know it. I've never had to play Skull and Bones with Jane in the last 8 years.
Once you log into the computer, assuming that you're not logging in at 3 a.m., Alan will tell you that you have to come back the computer will tell you that you have to come back at 3 a.m. to activate a fun ghost puzzle. Is it midnight?
Yeah, it's midnight to 4 a.m.
Here, you just take it.
So, once you get into Alan's computer, it tells you that there are 13 ghosts hidden around Blackmoor Manor, and if you find all 13 in the allotted time, then you will win a special surprise on Alan's computer. And apparently they're very shy, though, and they only come out in the early hours of the morning, i.e. midnight to 4 a.m. And so what Nancy's supposed to do is she sets her clock to midnight, and she goes down to the Great Hall through the library, logs into the computer, and Alan's cheery voice goes, "So who's ready to go on a ghost hunt?" And you go ahead and click start, and 13 ghosts will then pop out around the place, and they'll be like little Halloween decorations that glow, and they come out of the walls, and they come out of the banisters and staircases and stuff. And Nancy has something like 5 minutes to go find them all and tap each one, and then report back to the computer. And
ghosts spawn all around the manor, and it's actually a little difficult because you have to scan every single part of the screen, almost having to go to every single screen in the entire game. Some of them are really well hidden, like pressed really thick into the wall and everything, and you gotta really be observant in order to see them because they're very tiny, it's worth noting. But after activating all 13, you go back to the computer and it will give you a little tip about a potential secret passageway in the West Hall.
I gotta admit, the prize isn't as earth-shaking as you think it is. I guess it's important to the rest of the game, but it's still just a fun puzzle to do. I thought it was good and silly. It really paints a picture of what kind of a guy Alan was. He seemed like a really cheery and fun grandfather. And so, now it's my turn to talk about my favorite puzzle, and that has gotta be the Endgame Forge, because I have a reason why I love this puzzle, and that's because there is very little direction that the game gives you as to how you figure it out. But Julian and I were playing this game about a year ago, and we managed to solve it through some crazy way, because the way it works is, at the very end of the game, Nancy finds an old medieval forge deep underneath the castle, where she finds a custom mold that she needs to be used to make the correct key configuration to open up the vault to the Penvillin family treasure to see what's inside. And it's a 3x4 grid with 12 different symbols that are all like plus signs, and you have to figure out if the left side stays in and you make a mold there, or if the right side stays in, or if it's a full plus sign, etc. And somewhere in Jane's room, there is a book called the Mutus Liber, which is Latin for the silent book, and it's been passed down from Penvillin to Penvillin for generations. By the way, if we haven't mentioned already, the Penvillin family bloodline goes back to like the 13th century. It's been around for a long, long time.
And you can ask Jane about almost every single family member dating back to the 1400s in a family tree that's in a room, and Jane will go on to explain just a sentence or two about each one, the majority of them at least, and I think it's a really cool attention to detail that her interactive really stepped up to the plate and put in the extra mile for this little detail of the game, and I think it added a lot, honestly.
It's also important to notice that she's been taught to say certain opinions about people by Ethel, like that Eleanor, the lady who was burned as a witch in the 1500s, I think, wasn't actually a witch, and that she was wrongly accused, and she was just a healer of some sort. So
perhaps propaganda by Ethel.
Yeah. So anyhow, it turns out that in the Mutus Liber, there is a part of the book that shows a 3x4 grid, just like the same scale of the key mold that you have, but instead of there being the little symbols on it, there is just a strange symbol on each one that'll be like a comet or a compass or a star or something like that, and you start to realize that each symbol refers to a Penvillin family crest that's somewhere around the manor. And this is so cool to me, because of these 12 crests, there are little symbols that you just easily overlook that are symmetrically placed on the title banner of each one. And what you're supposed to do is just identify those symbols and figure out how you're supposed to make the mold for each square. And it's such a gratifying puzzle to figure out on your own.
Yeah, it's kind of like a multi-step puzzle, but once it all culminates to finally opening the family heirloom, it's very rewarding. It's a good puzzle in and of itself.
And as soon as you complete it, the end game cutscenes will begin to play, and that's about the end of the mystery.
Do you have any puzzles that are kind of breaking or not fun in this game?
Well, as far as...
What about the rotating rooms? That takes a lot of time for a new player.
For a new player, yeah, but once you understand how to work the rotating rooms puzzles, where you're in this strange underground machine where the rooms spin around every time you open and close a door, it's a really interesting puzzle. It's like a maze almost, and you just need to memorize the patterns. Alternatively, I think that Jane's games can get kind of boring if you keep on having to get new glow sticks and stuff. Jane makes you play little board games with her. Some of them are like reskinned games brought back for nostalgia, like Bowl from Secret of the Scarlet Hand. My least favorite part of this game is probably having to play Bowl in order to get like the key to the East Hall or something.
My least favorite is easily her jigsaw puzzle. It's timed and it's actually semi-difficult. It should not be that hard for what it is. I'll just say that on it.
Otherwise, as far as puzzles in the game go, we should, I guess, note the 6 column puzzles, where part of the game towards the end of it is you need to find 6 key pieces that are missing from the columns in the Great Hall so you can open them up. Some of them are pretty simple, like throwing a ball at a target down the slide to pick up a little timepiece. And then some of them are pretty difficult, and those are the ones that are like...
in Nancy's room.
Having to get the telescope from Jane by playing a game, and then using the telescope to look at the Poseidon mural and see a bunch of different numbers on it, and then going to Mrs. Drake and rearranging her plot plants to get the crank so that you can play with Betty, the little Go Fish maiden, and then using that crank on her to put in the secret code to figure out that she'll give you a piece if you win, and then beating her in a game, and then she gives you the piece. It gets to be pretty taxing.
I never noticed that many puzzles went into that one piece. That's crazy.
And then you use the little lens in the telescope afterwards to get another one, which is much easier. You just need to know the zodiac symbols and what order they come in, which is all just brightly displayed on Nancy's phone.
Other than that, there's a difficult slider puzzle at the beginning of the game, but nothing too game-breaking there. Alias's Wins is one of my favorite puzzles, actually. That's a fun one that happens once you get to the forge area. And all in all, puzzles are pretty strong in this game, but also they have their place on the difficulty spectrum.
Again, I would say this is almost a perfect game for puzzles because just about everything is really well explained, and the last thing in the game, the forge puzzle, is probably the only thing that's not well explained. But Lulu will tell you that, like, go take a look at the Mutus Liber, and once you make that connection that the symbols on the last page are of the crests, it's such a gratifying and just triumphant moment. That's probably one of my favorite moments in a Nancy Drew game ever. So this moves us into music.
The music is really good in this game.
Music is always good in every game, but
I have a particular track that I love, and that's Memoirs. It's the one that I'd say plays most often, and it's pretty fun. I don't know why I associate it so much with the library. I think it's just because it's like a somber little piece that's fitting for a library. And
it starts off with a real light piano, and then it breaks out into this dulcimer of some sorts. It's a nice piece.
We'll play it right here.
Now, my favorite track in this game is probably the fairy theme, which only really plays in the observatory, I think, and maybe in some secret passageways. And it's this light piano theme with like a harp of some sort in the background. I don't even know how to describe some of the instruments. They have evade my ears. But it's almost reminiscent of the garden theme from Secret of the Scarlet Hand. It's very mystical. It's titled Fairy, and it's just a really pretty one to hear. Another thing we should touch on in this game, for the music, is the Ballad of Bridget's Song.
Oh, yeah.
Which is a full-fledged Penvillin poem that is taught from generation to generation, which you can hear Ethel teaching Jane to sing in her room. You will know the lyrics to the Ballad of Bridget by the time you're done playing this song. It's the one that goes like, Bridget with her eyes so bright.
You hear it every single time you walk past Jane's room during lessons, which is a considerable part of each day. Ethel is always teaching it to her. I'm not sure why that's such an essential part of the curriculum, but it is.
I think it's because the lyrics are like about different parts of the Penvillin family riddles and stuff. If it hasn't been made clear, part of the Penvillin family tradition is that each generation of Penvillins are supposed to make their own super secret and tricky puzzle to help guard the Penvillin family treasure. And the entire game really is just unraveling the puzzles that have been set in place since the 1200s. And Nancy finally undoes them after all those years. But yeah, that's a really nice touch to the game. In the endgame letter, you get to hear like a special harpsichord version of the song, which I think is really cool.
All in all, the music's fitting for the environments, which is always what I look for in a game. It's catchy, it's cute. I don't know what else to say. It's good music, but it's not...
If I had to make one complaint, it's that whenever you're in the secret passageways, the music is always just like really choppy and, you know, kind of just spooky, but not even like a good kind of spooky. It's just kind of boring.
So, moving into the atmosphere, the part of the game that I say is most strong.
This is the best part of the game. But apart from like the locations and scenery being beautiful, the best part about the atmosphere and ambiance is the many scripted events and hauntings that take place throughout the game. Do you want to cover them all in order, and we'll alternate back and forth?
Yeah, sure. This game is actually pretty scary. You can make the case it's a top 5 scary Nancy Drew case, and it's mostly due to Nancy's continual nightmares that happen exactly at 3:15 in the morning, almost every time you fall asleep. The first one takes place the first night you get there, and Nancy, no matter what time you set your alarm clock for, will wake up at 3:15 in the morning to hear a really weird, almost demonic chanting. It's very mumbled.
It's very, very faint. What happens is you set the alarm clock, it beeps off, the screen goes black, and you're just like, Nancy's gonna wake up soon. And then it just fades into this really, really dim view of Nancy's room. There's a little bit of light coming through the window, and you just hear in the distance this really, really muffled chanting. And you don't even know what language they're speaking in. And spoiler alert, it's Ethel and Jane speaking in Latin. They're reciting the first few lines of the Iliad for some reason. But
okay, if I was staying at this place, this beautiful, luxurious manor, if I heard that in the middle of the night, I'm dipping.
It's just, Nancy gets up there and goes, maybe I should go and have a look around.
Yeah.
But it's such a crazy thing. I'd honestly call that one of the scariest moments in the Nancy Drew franchise, just because it's so unexpected and it's so early in the game. I'd call that on par with like a bunch of the spooks in Shadow at the Water's Edge and stuff.
But that's just the very first night. This happens in the first 10 minutes of gameplay.
Yeah.
There's 3 or 4 more hauntings and cool cutscenes that come that actually make this game kind of frightening.
So Nancy gets up and starts to walk around, and as soon as she leaves the room, she hears like a really sinister laugh, and she starts investigating, and she goes down the hallway and starts to hear more weird noises, and that's when she finds Lulu the parrot, and she starts to just think maybe it's just the parrot, reciting the Iliad in Latin, as parrots do. But, yeah. Nancy goes back to bed after Lulu tells her that everyone just stays in bed till 6 a.m. and that she should wait until then to go murking about.
6 a.m., 6 a.m.
Set your clock for 6 a.m. Nancy gets back into the bed, and the game continues as normal. Nothing else interrupts her that night. And then things go on. And let's see, what comes next? The nightmare is next, I'd say?
The next hauntings, yeah. The big one is the nightmare.
The nightmare is probably the most iconic part of the game that a lot of people remember leaving it, because you don't have to beat the game to get to the nightmare. It's about near the halfway point, I'd say, where it's much like the first haunting, where Nancy sets her alarm clock for the next morning, and then she wakes up just to that one dull, dim view of her room, and the moonlight's shining through the window, and there's like this weird musical note playing in the background. It's like somebody ran a beat across a xylophone or something, and Nancy looks up to the top of her bed, only there is no ceiling, and there's just this giant black hole where different paintings of penvillains that are hung around the estate just start appearing and morphing into each other. And that, to me, is the freakiest part about the dream.
Yeah, there's... that part of the game switches from Linda's turning into a werewolf to something supernatural is kind of happening in the manor, which was a cool transition. And these hauntings keep up, and you never feel like you're completely safe in the mansion after this, and I really enjoyed it. Moving on to another nightmare, Nancy, in her dreams, teleports to the main hall, and she looks out a window. The curtains are opening up to reveal the, once again, red huge eyes just leering at her. This was another really well done haunting. And there's a couple more to come, but you get the idea that every time Nancy goes to sleep, you're unsure whether she's going to wake up at 3:15 a.m. with another haunting, and they're all really well done and clever.
And this isn't like Ghost Dogs, where for the first night the dogs attack you, and then you're afraid to go to sleep for the next 2 nights, and you realize it never happens again throughout the game. These events happen 5 or 6 times throughout the game. Spooky things going bump in the night.
Now let's get to the one that isn't a nightmare.
Okay, yeah, so this is a really cool sequence of events where Nancy needs to find a plaque for, I think, Odo Penvillain to see his coat of arms, someone like that, because it has a puzzle solution on it about how to open up a gargoyle secret passageway, which, by the way, there's a lot of gargoyles in the manor, which are really cool and creepy and always add to a nice medieval ambiance. So Nigel says that he'll get you the coat of arms if you start transcribing some of his memoirs from paper to his computer, and he makes you do this little test your words per minute game on his computer, and then Nancy sits down and has this silly cutscene, which I think is really important because it helps loosen you up into thinking that this is just a casual fun part of the game, where Nancy just sits down and types for hours and makes fun of how boring Nigel's memoirs are. The first line is, "When I was born, I was very, very, very tiny." And then there's like an entry about the first time he ever tried a tomato. And it's really funny and lighthearted if you read it, and there's like a reference to the Shadow Ranch vegetables picking challenge. And then Nancy finishes the memoirs, and she has the opportunity to go looking through Nigel's notes on the chapters, which can be a little scandalous in some places, but it's not that important to the game. And she backs away from the computer, sees that Nigel left her a picture of the crest, and she realizes that it's really late, so she exits the library, and the lights in the Great Hall are suspiciously dimmed. And you want to get into what happens there?
Yeah. Nancy walks outside, kind of skulks and hides behind a pillar, and you find Jane and Ethel chanting something and
No
holding...
key without toil, no fire without oil.
Yeah, they're repeatedly saying that line, and both are holding like an urn of like oil or some sort of like silvery liquid.
It's oil.
Now there's a pipe, there's a hole, a small hole in the middle of the Great Hall, and Jane is almost like a ritual, pouring the oil and continually chanting this line down the pipe.
And before she pours it, she goes, "Oh, yeah, my actions ensure that my name will endure to the end, Penvillain."
So that line alone kind of seals the deal that this is some sort of really sketchy Penvillain ritual, and you don't even know if Ethel is making this up, or you can tell that Ethel definitely has a threshold over Jane, right?
Yeah.
And
she's got a grip on her.
Yeah. So it's only, you kind of view Jane as like innocent in this, and it kind of makes Ethel seem so much more suspicious because Jane doesn't know all that much about what's going on. You can tell Ethel is really who's leading this ritual.
And I think the scene is best summed up by Nancy's iconic line that she says after it, which appears in other games. That was a little creepy.
You can talk to both characters about this, actually, and they'll dismiss it for the most part. You play a little game on Jane where she talks about how there's no way she would have done a ritual in the middle of the night. Nancy goes on to say, I didn't say it about being in the middle of the night.
She goes, well, isn't that where most creepy rituals take place?
Yeah, so you kind of trap her in her own words right there, but...
She never admits to anything.
That was a really cool cutscene, another creepy one too, and I think it added a lot to the...
One of the last two hauntings is Nancy goes to bed and sets her alarm, and she's immediately woken up by the sound of someone or something trying to get into her room and just like clawing at the door. And it's like the noise Nancy makes when... It's literally the exact same noise of like the ghost dogs trying to get in through the door at the beginning of Ghost Dogs Moon Lake. And so Nancy gets up and checks outside in the hallway. Nobody's there, and then she turns around and sees claw marks on her door frame. And that one was just really spooky. It's easy to miss the claw marks, but once you notice them, it's just real.
Obviously, further propelling the idea that Linda is a werewolf gang.
Yeah. Then there's a sequence near the end of the game where Nancy wakes up in the morning and finds Mrs. Drake trying to talk Linda into eating some food. And when she refuses, Mrs. Drake leaves some sort of weird talisman or charm over Linda's door. And you can ask Mrs. Drake about it, and she insisted it's a good luck charm. But you're kind of suspicious because of the 6-month habitation clause, which states that if Linda Penvlin cannot stay in the manor for 6 months straight, then 50% of the estate ownership immediately passes to the next valid heir, which would be Letitia Drake herself. And then finally, the last haunting of the game comes near the end of it, where Nancy just wakes up. There's no trigger this time. There's nothing that wakes her up. She just gets up in the morning, goes outside her room, and there is a cloaked figure walking down the hallway away from her, just giggling maniacally. And so Nancy turns the corner following her. It's a cinematic of Nancy walking, and she goes, who was that? And she turns the corner and finds a pair of glow-in-the-dark Jeepers Creepers night vision goggles that could have been used to make the red eyes that she saw when she first arrived.
And that's when it's official that there's nothing supernatural going on at all.
There's no Beast of Blackmoor.
Yeah, there has to be some logical explanation for Linda's transformation, and someone is pulling the strings from higher up here. It's just a matter of who.
Okay, so that's about the meat of the atmosphere covered. I guess we'll cover each room briefly. So we already said that Nancy's room, purple walls, red velvet bed, and the Poseidon mural.
Yeah, Nancy's room is actually probably my favorite part in the game, honestly.
Really?
Yeah, definitely.
For one thing, I just love the hallways. They have like a black and red terracotta floor, and
Well, the manor itself is beautiful, and it's someplace that I'd love to go in real life. I love all parts of it. The conservatory could actually be my least favorite part.
I like the conservatory too. I think that it's a great tone shift from the rest of the game and when you learn more about it, you figure out that a lot of the plants that are actually in the conservatory were made in that laboratory by John Penvlin in the early 1900s. There's actually an exotic plant in the conservatory where if Nancy touches it, it'll eat her alive.
One critique I have about the atmosphere is that the winding secret passageways underneath the manor are a bit too dark and long. I would have it could have been a lot more concise had it been 1 or 2 staircases down to the rotating rooms and throw a puzzle in there along the way and everything, but instead it is like 25 different screens of having to move forward down underneath the manor.
And my biggest gripe with the secret passageways is that they're all so dark besides the forge at the end that you can only illuminate them by just holding a glow stick or a glowing rock that's probably giving Nancy skin cancer. And
it's probably uranium.
It's probably the same stuff from White Wolf, yeah. But you just have to wave it around the screen. You can only see in a little bubble around the rock, and that kind of takes away from the leisurely exploring vibe of the game. Otherwise, the Great Hall is really well lit. The floor is just this beautiful design of red, yellow, and like sandstone and green. And the library is very pretty too. You can see balconies in the background where there's more spots and bookshelves that you can't even see. Nigel always like gives you little brief synopsises of each bookshelf. He's like, oh, you'll probably won't find anything interesting there. Those are all law books from the 13th century.
Now, 2 things that would have made this game better, in my opinion, is A, being able to explore the kitchen that Jane allegedly exploded.
Yeah.
And B, being able to go outside.
Being able to go outside is like the one thing to me that this atmosphere and environment does wrong, because whenever a Nancy Drew game confines you to being inside the entire time, that instantly makes me like it less. I mean, I can forgive a game where it's like Treasure in the Royal Tower, where in the second half you get to go outside, but I never really clicked with games like Deadly Device, where you have to stay inside the entire game. And I know that's like your favorite game, Julian, but that's just me. Although I give this game a pass almost because everything inside is fascinating and gothic and just really cool to look at. If I had to sum up the atmosphere in just one term, it would have to be just
Royal.
Scooby-Doo.
Scooby-Doo.
This place feels like a Scooby-Doo manor with all sorts of talk of witches and werewolves and monsters and stuff.
It would be a good setting for an old-fashioned Scooby-Doo.
It is
episode.
a good setting.
Now, let's get into the ending of the game, which in my opinion is pretty weak.
Yeah, the ending is honestly probably one of the weakest endings we've seen in Nancy Drew yet.
I did not like the culprit reveal whatsoever.
Yeah.
Let's talk about what the treasure is, first of all.
Okay, yeah. So Nancy forges together that key that we talked about earlier. Such a triumphant puzzle. Love that puzzle. And she twists it into the lock, and it opens up, and immediately Jane Penvlin just comes down the 25 screens of stairs and goes, "Whatever you just found, it's mine."
Which, sure, whatever, it's yours, I guess, because she's technically a Penvlin. But she did not have to go through this insane process of turning Linda into a werewolf.
Yeah, or making her think so. But
I understand her theory, she wants to get her out of the house and everything, but this ultimately didn't affect her ability to find the treasure, did it?
no, not really. I think that was just kind of an ulterior motive of hers at this point, because Jane's motives are actually kind of sad. It almost makes you feel like they wrote her as the culprit to kind of give solace to some of the fans of the franchise who may be having parents going through a divorce or separation of some sort. Because her overall motive is that she misses her real mother, and she doesn't really understand that she's not coming back, and she thinks that maybe if she can scare Linda into thinking that she's cursed by marrying Hugh, then she'll want to leave him and she might have a shot at getting her old mother back.
Yeah, I just feel like she should have made that obvious realization that she can't make all that disappear through making her turn into a werewolf.
I mean, cut her some slack. She's like 10 years old.
Sure, I guess, but she's also got the brains to put
Yeah,
to make this very believable werewolf transformation.
Yeah.
You see, what she does is she puts hair growth material inside of all of Linda's moisturizers, which she obviously applies to her arms and hands and everything.
And she starts slipping her Mrs. Drake's medication, so she gets drowsy and has dry mouth and pale skin all the time.
So she's pulling all the strings that made Linda sick,
Yeah.
but I don't know. She just kind of had a lousy execution.
The Penvlin family treasure turns out to be a meteorite, which has been passed down for centuries upon centuries as the precious piece of Penvlin history. And Jane has absolutely no respect for this. She's just like, a stupid rock? That's what all this secrecy and suspicion's been for all these years? And she just runs over and picks it up, and it activates a trap, and just a giant jail cell gets dropped on her where she can't breathe. And Nancy has to back away, otherwise you both just get trapped in there and suffocate. It's a really grim ending. But Nancy gets her to back away, and she starts saying, "Nancy, please let me out, I didn't mean to do it." And then Nancy just goes, "Do I detect a guilty conscience?" And then she just spills the beans about like every single little misdeed she's done around the manor.
Now, the endgame challenge is a callback to a previous puzzle. It was the Aliases Wins puzzle. All you have to do is control this huge giant that happens to be lurking there in the forge, Alias. He picks up the metal jail cell that's holding Jane hostage, and then you get a cut to the endgame letter.
Which is where the Dulcimer Bridget song plays. And so, basically summarized, the Penvlin family history is all about protecting the meteorite, which in the old days they must have thought to give them magical powers. In modern day, they just kind of understand that it's a rock, but it's a very precious rock that came from outer space. But anyhow, Penvlin tradition is all about each generation making a puzzle to help protect this from outsiders and make sure that the secret stays secret. And this, mind you, is after Nigel leaves the manor, and he comes back to get his laptop, which he forgets. But it's important to note that Mrs. Drake and Ethel and everyone makes Nancy and Linda and all the people swear to secrecy that they have to never speak about this. So I don't know why Nancy's just writing the letter to Hannah about it. But it's one thing that I really like to say about the game is that Linda, Hugh, and Jane are now bonding because they're trying to make their own puzzle to help carry on the tradition, and that's kind of heartwarming because it makes it look like they're giving being a family a good shot again. And then Nigel comes back to the manor looking for his laptop, and he can sense that something's going on, and Nancy's just like, "Oh no, nothing's happening," and he's just like, "Come on, Nancy, tell me what's going on. I gotta know. This will be great for my book."
Now, this obviously isn't one of those games where the culprit gets prison time or anything, because we actually find out that Jane has a rather successful online video game career through Danger Design, the 14th game.
Yeah. And,
But I think that's actually a critique that I have, is I like the games where suspects actually get reprimanded by the law more than ones where they get off scot-free like this one.
I mean, it almost feels like they went into this game thinking it's before they even started animating it, let's make the culprit a child. No one will see it coming. And then they just had a lot of trouble making Jane a decent character. Especially, like, physically. She just looks so weird. I mean, realistically, I feel like Mrs. Drake had the most motive because then she'd get 50% of the estate. But
that
also
would have been too obvious, though.
And it would have been a little bit ridiculous to just have her doing her culprit confrontation talk in her stupid Cockney voice.
I don't want to imagine that.
I feel like the best fit for a culprit might have been Ethel. I don't know. She's definitely the most menacing character, especially just because she jump scares you every single time you meet her.
I could see that.
But otherwise,
I can't picture Nigel being the culprit
no.
whatsoever.
That would be like Lamont being the culprit in Crystal Skull.
So how do you rank this game?
Alright, well,
It's got some really strong points, but it also has some notable flaws.
I would call this probably the best atmosphere of any Nancy Drew game yet, and also probably the best puzzles. The characters are okay. Some of them I just don't like Mrs. Drake, and Jane has her falls too. Nigel is my king, though. The story's pretty cool, especially when you wrap it all up and you understand about like the Penville family history and stuff. I just really like the puzzles in this game, because when I was younger, I could hardly read when I played this game, and I didn't understand a lot of stuff because I was impatient. And now that I realize that if you read every book that the game throws at you, and you at least skim them, then you will be able to solve every puzzle in the game without any help. And that's just such a glorious feeling when you play a Nancy Drew.
For me, the strong points are music, atmosphere, and puzzles. And you can make the case that the story is really compelling too.
The story's good too.
The suspects, which is a very big bulk of the game, I gotta say they weren't the strongest in this, nor did I really care for the ending.
Yeah, I would honestly probably call this my least favorite ending of the game so far. I would call this
compared to Scarlet Hand.
I would call the Scarlet Hand ending better than this one.
Interesting.
Besides the part where like everyone just comes out and starts reciting, it just turns into a poetry slam. But
you want to break down the tiers and how we rank this?
Yeah. So the way that we rank this is we don't like to give the games numbers out of 10 because some Nancy Drew games are performing better in practice than they are on paper. So the way that we like to do this is just like a grading scale where A is good, F is bad, and then if a game really shines, then we put it in the S tier. So far we've handed out a couple of S's. They've all been from me or Sylvia, because Sylvia loves her Shadow Ranch, and I love my Ghost Dogs and Deception Island.
We'll get to see if I have any S's later on down the road.
Yeah, I think I'm going to be more critical of the games to come, to be honest.
So, for me, I'd say this game is an in-betweener. It still has a place in my heart. I think it's very well deserving of a B.
Yeah, I mean, the ending can make or break any story, and I feel like depending on who you are, this ending can ruin it for you. I know it ruined it for my dad. He was just like, it better not be the little girl, that's all I can say. And then, it was the little girl. But otherwise, I feel like the puzzles in this game are what it's worth, and the music and all that stuff. It's a really well-structured game in that sense. I would give it a better B than Julian. I'd give it like a B+, but I don't think it gets an A because the suspects can get annoying, the parrot gets annoying, I love the boar's head pug, and I hate that Nigel has to leave later on and it's all Nancy's fault because she scares him by making a statue move and doesn't tell him it was her. But overall, I would call this just shy of an A.
Overall, it's a strong game with some notable flaws.
Thanks for tuning in for another review, everybody. We recently uploaded a nostalgic long play of No Commentary Curse of Blackmoor Manor, in case you'd like to have some spooky Blackmoor Manor ASMR vibes to go to bed to. It's just a nice, cool video to play in the background, listen to characters talk. It's much like an audiobook with dialogue and a soundtrack.
We'll be cranking out reviews to come, as well as more ambiance, gameplays, and thanks very much for watching. We hope you enjoyed listening to our review. Let us know what you think too. We love hearing everyone's input on these games.
Vote for Holt, everybody.
Vote for Holt, baby.
Also, we'd like to say that we have been having a little bit of technical difficulties with games in the early teens. Secret of the Old Clock won't download either from disc or from digital. We're going to keep on troubleshooting with that, and Danger by Design is just proving really, really difficult for us and not fun because we don't like that game. And also, we had an MP4 corruption on our computer, and we lost our first attempt at this review and our entire long play footage of Legend of the Crystal Skull. So we're going to have to speed run through that again. We apologize for the interruptions of our regular schedule, but don't worry, we'll keep on cranking out videos as fast as we can. Take care, everybody.